All right, so welcome. Today, right now, we're going to go over who owns the medicine, psychedelics at the crossroads of empire and earth. As psychedelics enter mainstream discourse, they do so through frameworks shaped by Western ideologies and regulations that often sideline and appropriate indigenous knowledge systems that have long held these medicines as sacred. This talk explores the tension between the benefit of traditional healing practices and the institutionalism of psychedelics in Western pharmacotherapy. We'll examine how the colonial gaze shapes what is considered legitimate healing, who is recognized as a healer, and how medicines are extracted, commodified, and recontextualized for profit. And our speaker is Dakota MacColl. So I'd like to welcome Dakota to the stage, please. Thank you.
So I just wanted to introduce myself before I got started. Tansei, Cailean Dakota MacColl Nitzigatson. Nice to meet you. My name is Dakota. I am a fourth-year medical student here at the University of Minnesota. I am from the Ronge Indian Band in Saskatchewan, and I sort of have a background in like traditional healing and ceremony. I come from a line of like medicine people on both sides of my family, mom and dad, and I'm also applying for my residency next month, so I'm hoping to do kind of like gender affirming dermatology and like work in the derm space and kind of like increase our quality of life. So why am I here talking about psychedelics? So my tribe's use of psychedelics was like a very kind of, it varied on the region, right? So there's lots of different kinds of Cree people. It depended on the region. We did have some use of psychedelics. I personally, like in my family, don't know of any specific practices that like we had used. But essentially, I'm just here to talk about, right, this kind of tension as someone who is like walking in two worlds, who like feels the tension every day as like an Indigenous person who has like cultural teachings and like traditional knowledge in an academic space and like in a pharmacotherapy space, and kind of like, you know, how those rub up against each other and what to do with that. So let's go to the next slide. And essentially, this can be like more of a discussion. If you do have anything to say, it's like hard to see, but you can like raise your hand or just like wave frantically, and we can kind of have like a conversation. I'm also just gonna kind of like quickly go through things. I have more of kind of like a discussion piece at the end. But essentially we're gonna discuss like the difference in relationship, right, between like Indigenous forms of knowing and pharmaceutical ways of knowing. We're gonna look at several forms of kind of like commodification and appropriation of psychedelic medicine, and then kind of just, again, discuss those areas of tension and the possibility of respectful integration of that knowledge. Let's go to the next slide. So, sorry. Okay, so Indigenous knowledge systems, right? So there have long been sacred roles of medicines, right, such as peyote, ayahuasca, psilocybin, San Pedro, iboga, right? These are like a wide kind of net of like medicines that people all over the world and Indigenous communities have used. And it's embedded, and their like being is embedded in like cultural, spiritual, and ecological relationship, right? Next slide. And it's rooted in healing, right? And healing is communal, it is relational, it is ceremonial. And some of the values that I think are sort of at the forefront of this knowledge are like reciprocity, healing, honor, sustainability, and kind of that seventh generation thinking. So like, what am I doing now to be a good ancestor? What am I doing now to steward relationships with these medicines so that the seventh generation past me can still have those relationships in a good way? Let's go to the next slide. And then there's mainstream psychedelics, right? So psych in the mainstream, this is kind of like a rapid growth, like boom in research and therapy. There's sort of like FDA like breakthrough therapy designations with a lot of these medications like psilocybin and MDMA. And there are a lot of startups and like pharmaceutical interest that currently have these like billion-dollar projections. And if we go to the next slide, this is just one example of a recent article that was published in the Journal of CNS Drugs. This was from 2021, and it's called Molecular Mechanisms of Psilocybin and Implications for the Treatment of Depression. So again, very wordy. And if we go to the next slide, we can just quickly look at the abstract. I know it might be a little fuzzy, but just some things that like stood out to me, right? The aim of this review is to synthesize the current understanding of the receptor pharmacology and neuronal mechanisms underlying the psychedelic and putative antidepressant properties of psilocybin. And so when I see that, I'm thinking like, well, what is the current understanding and whose understanding is this based off of, right? And then let's go to the next slide. I do not mean, okay, that's so small. I'm just gonna read it to you. I don't mean at all to like pick on this particular startup, right? But this is just like when I was looking at kind of like psychedelic startups, like who is kind of leading the charge here. There was this website about like the top psychedelic startups to watch this was last year, so 2024. And there's this ATAI Life Sciences that currently has, I mean, it could be more now, but at the time they had $93 million in funding. They had about 200 employees and they were located in Munich, Germany. And like, you know, the description says like they partner with innovative companies to develop diverse therapeutic approaches, including digital solutions and novel drug development. And it says that like the work that they're currently doing is like pushing boundaries in mental health treatments. And I'm reading this to you because I kind of want people to understand like the language that a lot of these spaces are using in terms of like pushing boundaries, like breakthrough. And also, you know, they're talking about partnership with like companies, digital solutions. Like, what does that mean? I don't know, but it is something to think about. So if we go to the next slide, sort of what I gathered from this and sort of what I see is that the goals of like current mainstream, and when I say mainstream, I mean like academic, right? Or like pharmaceutical, psilocybin, like those kinds of things. I see a lot of goals being about profit, right? I see a lot of this kind of rat race of like who is the first, who can be the first to get this legalized, who can be the first to get this on the market, who can make the most money. And this is about commodification, right? So it's about taking a medicine and turning it into a form of profit. I also see a lot of questions about ownership, whether you're owning data, owning the medicine, owning the materials, and also like beneficence. Is this something that is a part of this? Maybe. I don't know. So if we go to the next slide, I just summarize this with like what I see in this is a difference between relationship to something and relationship with something, right? So if you have a relationship to something, there's sort of an othering that happens in my eyes, and that too can make extraction easier. To me, a relationship to something is sort of one-sided. There's a power imbalance and there's ego involved. Versus relationship with something, there is a reciprocity, there is a mutual benefit or aid that is happening in that relationship. There is respect and there is a lot of humility. Especially if you're saying like, what relationship do I have with this plant and what relationship does this plant have with me? So those are sort of the differences I see. And then if we go to the next slide, I talk a little bit about colonial gaze. So what do I mean by that? So if we just look at like colonial or colonization, like the definition, it's the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. So like in general, I'm talking about like colonization, specifically of Turtle Island, or like North and South America. But more specifically, what I'm talking about is like governmental bodies, regulations, and this is sort of what comes in to the conversation of like who decides what's real medicine, right? The FDA, pharmaceutical companies, trials, funded projects, published in these journals. I'm not saying that these are necessarily like bad, and I'm not saying that evidence-based science should be dismissed because I practice evidence-based science, but I'm more pointing out like who isn't at the table here, right? Or on these boards that are funding these projects, who isn't being invited into these inner circles that are creating these like billion-dollar projection projects. I also think about biomedical and ancestral validation and like validity, right? So thinking about the scientific method and kind of this like Western form of science and like what does it mean to be valid, what does it mean to be published in these journals, who decided that, and then also with ancestral validation and like indigenous science and like traditional ways of knowing and these life ways, who isn't validating that and why. Is something to think about. And also like extraction without reciprocity, right? Like this is again back to that relationship of like to versus with. So if we go to the next slide, again, this is pretty small, but this is just like one aspect of like regulation or kind of oversight is the drug scheduling system, right? So drug scheduling is one example of this oversight, and essentially they define the schedules into different categories based on the drug's acceptable medical use, and the drug's abuse or dependency potential. So that's like their definition is about like the abuse rate is a determinant factor in the scheduling of this drug. And again, who is making these decisions, who's not at the table, right? So if we go to the next slide, I just kind of wanted to put these quotes next to each other just to kind of see how it feels. So if there is a Schedule 1 drug, that means there's like no medical use. And we see that for certain medications that we would consider as like sacred or medicinal, right? And then there's also these spaces, these same spaces are using terms like high medical promise, breakthrough therapy, and a lot of that is involving psychedelic medication. And so I feel a tension there. I don't know if you can see it or feel it yet, but I really do. When we put them next to each other, like I see kind of this like novel or this new thing. Like we've been doing this, right? Like we've been doing this for a while. Who is this a breakthrough for? It's certainly not a breakthrough for us. I feel it's very dismissive of sovereignty. So next slide, I want to talk a little bit about like commodification and appropriation. So has anyone heard of biopiracy before? This was like something interesting that I came across in kind of like looking into this and kind of just seeing what I find. So essentially when we think about commodification or kind of taking these medications and like recontextualizing them, there's a lot of patents involved. And there's also this idea of biopiracy, which is like exploiting like plant or animal species by claiming patents to restrict their use and their general use by the public. There's also like medical and spiritual tourism, which is like, I talk about this more in the kind of traditional like capitalistic like extractive sense of things, and then also like for-profit clinics. So if we go to the next slide, this is a book from someone whose argument is that actually patenting traditional medicines could be helpful. And like a lot of, many Indigenous communities are having to resort to legal rights and like legal cases due to pharmaceuticals that are derived from their traditional medicines. And this has led to some kind of questions about like, what is this patent system doing and like what does it mean and how are we using it? So this is someone who actually believes that this can protect the like traditional medicines, right? Like protect by using patents. And again, I kind of wonder like who's sitting at the patent table and why are they making that argument? And like from the World Health Organization, there's a World Intellectual Property Organization or WIPO, and it's primarily concerned with like the protection of traditional medical knowledge in the IP sense, which is protection against unauthorized use by third parties. And currently they're seeking to develop kind of this like international legal instrument that would provide effective protection of traditional and cultural expressions and traditional knowledge and address the IP aspects of access and benefit sharing. And something to think about here, like, again, I'm just trying to introduce this in terms of like, why are they making these arguments? Like, who is benefiting from this? If we go to the next slide, this was actually, has anyone heard about this? The like turmeric patent that like went south. Okay, so this was like a controversy. It was centered around a US patent granted in 1995 for the use of turmeric in wound healing. What happened was the patent was challenged by India's Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, the CSIR, as it was deemed to lack novelty, right? Citing the long-standing traditional use of turmeric in wound healing in like traditional practices. And so the US Patent Office eventually did revoke the patent and recognize the prior art of turmeric's like traditional uses. And this case is often cited as an example of biopiracy, where traditional knowledge is like exploited without proper recognition or benefit to the original kind of like stewards of this medicine. I was just really blown away by that. And then if we go to the next slide, I don't mean to pick on this person in particular, okay? Again, this was like me Google searching and just seeing like, okay, if I wanted to try psychedelics, if I wanted to try ketamine, like what is available to me? And so when we talk about kind of like medical tourism and like for-profit clinics and like retreats, you can see kind of what's included in this package. This is called the Pathway to Peace 7-day retreat. You get ketamine-associated psychotherapy, group meditation, a sound bath ceremony, airport transfers, hot yoga, nourishing meals. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that the packages for this start at $2,295. So again, right, like these for-profit kind of groups are charging like thousands of dollars for ketamine or psilocybin sessions, where you get like a salt lamp and coloring books. And just in my like research, again, I'm not trying to pick on these people in particular, but like I didn't see any hint of like indigenous knowledge practices or like local beneficence to the people of Costa Rica from this website. So this is like, to me, another example of kind of that like extraction and kind of commodification into a profit model that is benefiting only people that have access to that kind of money to receive that like treatment, right? And if we go to the next slide, again, right, so there is tension here. There is tension in community, and what I mean by that is that, like, if you are a part of the Indigenous community, we have different teachings, right? Like, we're not a pan-Indigenous community. We each have very different and, like, respectable practices, and like, for example, in my tribe, like, there are some healers. Like, one of my teachings is that, like, you're never supposed to, like, pay for medicine. Like, I can't buy sweetgrass. I can't buy Capol, right? I have to trade or someone has to gift that to me. And I can never offer my services in healing for a profit. It has to be for an exchange, a relationship, a reciprocity, something of that nature. And there are healers in my community who are now offering their services for profit. Versus non-community members who are doing the same. I feel like that creates tension, but I wonder, like, why, right? Like, who drove this? How do we decide who is legitimate and who is not? Who taught these community members that this is what they need to make their living? And it frankly doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? What about those that are reconnecting? What about Indigenous people that are reconnecting? Ultimately, I just bring this up as a talking point, but, like, frankly, it's up to our communities to, like, decide how to handle those things. But I just want to say that there are outside influences of colonization that do create tension even within our community. And ultimately, like, it's up to us to kind of make informed decisions. And I can't be the end-all be-all of, like, I'm just one person, right? Like, I don't have all the answers, but it is just, I guess, kind of my job today to, like, introduce more thought into how we address the tension and how the tension got to be in this space. I also see tension in kind of the accessibility through clinics to this medicine, especially in, like, a local way, with people, like Indigenous people and people who've stewarded these medications, like, at the helm. And I see tension between the exclusivity of, like, high-cost treatment and the need for travel to do this elsewhere in a different country. There is a difference between being able to, like, access these medicines locally and then being in a position where, oh, I can like throw a few $1,000s away to, like, go to Costa Rica and with the salt lamps and the coloring and kind of have this experience. Like, that to me is a very kind of privileged different way versus kind of like a local accessibility. I also feel tension between like the risk of cultural erasure, right? In a lot of these sort of for-profit clinic models, like I don't see traditional knowledge being held, I don't see it being respected, and there is a loss there. I also see the potential for destigmatization of these medications and these medicines, right? And I think that there's kind of like, how do we have both? How do we protect against erasure while destigmatizing and kind of like fighting back a little bit on some of these like really heavy legal restrictions that like obviously we didn't have those before the federal government. There is also tension between safety regulations and criminalizing traditional healers, right? I think as someone who practices traditional healing and is in like an academic medicine, right? Like I think there are ways to be mindful and to be safe and to steward medicine in an appropriate and respectful and a good way. And also, like, I can't do that if I am criminalized in this world, like in the Western world, for doing that and like wanting safety. And also, like, I think, you know, how do we balance like institutional access versus cultural survival, right? This is kind of another part of that, like erasure versus destigmatization. There's kind of like an electricity between those that I don't know how to pull that apart and work through that, but I just want to introduce this to this space so we can try and figure it out together. If we go to the next slide, like, how did we get here? What are the answers? I don't know. But if we go to the next slide, I think that part of it is because of events like this. So this was in 2009. There was this dude that, you know, had this like self-help business. I don't know if y'all have heard about this. There was like a really good documentary on it. But this dude had like a new age retreat. He led a sweat lodge. He was not Indigenous. I don't know if I can even call that a sweat lodge. He led like, you know, something. And people died because he was not practicing that the right way. In fact, there were people asking to get out. They were too hot. He wasn't taught how to do this in a traditional sense, in a good way. He was not invited into this space. He just made it happen himself, and he ended up killing people. And so he was arrested. He was convicted of 3 counts of negligent homicide. He served 2 years. He was released under supervision, and following his release, he immediately relaunched his self-help business. I think a lot of that in part has to do with who he was and what he looked like. I don't know if I can say that if I did that I would be getting out in a couple of years, if you know what I'm saying, if you're picking up what I'm putting down. So if we go to the next slide, like, how do we get here? What are the answers? I don't know. It's nuanced, right? I don't have the answers. I can't make the answers happen. There's no right answer. But this is the tension that we have, right? This is the tension that we have from walking in 2 worlds. And it's this discussion and this tension that's our responsibility to handle, especially if we are stewarding in these spaces, right? So if we go to the next slide, is there a potential for respectful integration? Maybe. I think that if we center Indigenous leadership in research and policy, that is helpful. I think if we have sharing agreements and like reparative economic models, if we are working in academia and like farm and like medicine with this data, with this knowledge, data is a gift. If we treat it as such and give that back to the people and practice data sovereignty, I think that is a form of respectful integration. And also legal protection. But when I say legal protection, do I mean legal protection from the federal government or do I mean legal protection from sovereign nations? I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. Like I said, I'm from the First Nations, I'm from Canada, and so things are a bit different there. I'm not like 100% sure how that works here, but I do think that that needs to be kind of part of the conversation. And also, like, I think we really need to kind of decolonize our psychedelic education, right? Like, I think that a lot of language that is used in these spaces, not saying that anybody is guilty of this here, but I'm just saying that, like, when I encounter these spaces, I think there's a lot of, again, sort of that language from earlier, like new age, breakthrough, like novel, and I think that the most basic first step that you can do to kind of like decolonize these practices is to say, like, again, like, people have been out here knowing this, okay? Like, it's been happening, we've been knowing this. And I think that's part of this integration, like, into this new space is like that acknowledgement. But it needs to go beyond an acknowledgement into an actual relationship and kind of like a reciprocal relationship between these communities that obviously still exist and are part of these communities and this community that is growing. So next slide, is it possible? Maybe, but I don't think that currently, as we have things set up legally, you know, with regulations and these sorts of things, I don't know if it's possible with how things are set up right now. My argument is that, you know, we really would need a lot of kind of structural change within organizations, within leadership, within legality, within restrictions, and even within perception, to truly like start that journey of like respectful integration. We have a long way to go, and I don't know if we can use the structure of the house that we're living in to all live together. I wonder if we have to build something new to really make this happen. So for integration, if we go to the next slide, again, I think that this is another issue of like relationship to versus relationship with. And now we're not just talking about the medicine, we're talking about each other, we're talking about our kin, we're talking about our communities. How have our communities built tension through colonization? How can we start repairing those bridges? What do reparations look like? What does community building look like? And what does stewardship of this medicine look like? So now I'm kind of approaching our like reflection and kind of discussion part. So if we go to the next slide, these don't have to be like talked about amongst ourselves, but I just want to kind of have people reflect on this. Like, who benefits from psychedelics entering the mainstream and who benefits from them entering pharmacologic spaces? Another thing I want people to think about are like whose voices are missing from these conversations, between communities, with companies in medicine, et cetera, and how do we invite people to the table in a good way? And also, like, how do we participate, we as like a general we, everyone in this room, participate in like reciprocity and relationship with the medicine and communities that shepherd this medicine in ways that are accountable, ethical, and just. So if there are any like questions or thoughts, or if you do want to talk amongst yourselves, we have about like 5 minutes before I have to kind of like start closing up. 10 minutes. I have 10 minutes before I actually have to like say my last thoughts. Does anyone have any like initial thoughts, or like would it be a good idea to kind of like discuss with the people around you and just kind of think about these ideas? Yeah.
I'll throw something out there.
Yeah.
There's a mic right up
You
here.
want me to get up here?
Sorry, I meant to say that into the mic. If you have any audience questions, come right up here, please.
And this is where I do a stand-up comedy routine. I'm going to have a hard time, I think, articulating this question, but I want to preface it by saying, first of all, I'm a therapist, and the thing that I've been really trying to unpack in my own practice and in my own body is colonialism, and in that process, understanding that the basic premise for the work that we do is diagnosis, and that the manual that we use for that is written by people with ties to pharmaceutical companies. And so when you recognize that we have an entire system that is set up to control specific populations, women, children, people of color, queer people, and then we start talking about psychedelics in the mainstream and being kind of co-opted by pharmaceutical companies. When we talk about indigenous plants and, you know, I think about Monsanto and the way that big corporations stole, you know, individual farms for that process. And so I guess part of what I'm reflecting on is when you were asking about wanting, you know, talking about wanting to have a seat at these tables, like, is it, do you want a seat at these tables, or do these tables need to go?
Exactly. And that's kind of what I mean. Like, the call's coming from inside the house, you know what I'm saying? Like, and I think that's the question that creates part of this tension is like, can we have a seat at these tables in a respectful way with the house that's already been built? Or do we need to build another house to have these conversations in? My argument is it's more the latter. I don't think that the way that the roots go deep, right? The roots of colonization, of racism, of all of these things go really deep. And I don't know if the table that I want to sit at, even though I like signed up to sit at it and I'm hundreds and thousands of dollars in debt to sit at these tables, are places that I really want to be. And some of my own tension that I'm unpacking too, right, is like, how do I as an Indigenous person understand, you know, in my bio it says I'm like passionate about like coalescing aspects of Western healing and traditional medicine, but like, I think that in some cases, I don't want to bring my traditions into that space because they're not respected. And I think that there are some things that need to be protected. And in that way, like, I don't know that, I don't know. And I guess my reflection back to you is like, I don't know. And I think that we ought to build something new together because we're all existing here, and you know, there is a way to move forward with reparations and relationship that is not necessarily antagonistic towards each other, right? Yeah. Hey.
Hi, thank you for coming. I guess I think of the Audre Lorde quote, you cannot dismantle the master's house without the master, I am not good at public speaking, but basically you can't reform a system that was not built for us.
Yeah.
And was not even considering us until very recently, I feel like. I feel like while I do love that people are very interested in Indigenous medicine and practices, I see there's so much exploitation that comes with it that people don't know they're doing that. And then things like that happen.
Yes.
And they associate sweats, which I've been doing my whole life, with danger, with unsafety, without intention, which is the opposite of my experience and the opposite of the communities that I've spent a lot of my life with. And so I just think a lot about Indigenous people worldwide because my Indigenous people heritage are not from Turtle Island. We come from other places, and I feel like there's a invisibility of Indigenous people worldwide that our exploitations are very similar. I grew up on a reservation, so I can, but as we're all relatives and we're all fighting for this land that we're so tied to that the Western world just sees as a product to create. And so that's why I feel like this discussion is going to take a very long time, especially with legalities, because treaties have been broken, have been completely tampered with, and have completely destroyed generations of people that have a very hard time accepting outsiders at this point. So I feel like, you know, you almost have to be invited to those spaces by them before they will, like, there has to be a level of trust that has to come, not in this entitled, like, you must, because I like this, I must be allowed.
Right.
I'm like, they have the right to refuse anyone who they feel like is just going to take it, write a book about it, and make a lot of money, and then not do, and so I think there's a lot of tension, and I feel like this conversation is one I've had 1,000 times in the last couple months.
Yeah.
Because I do appreciate people caring about Indigenous people, but I also feel like the language and the awareness of how colonial things are, especially, I'm going to bring up Palestine, you know, if that's colonization at work, whatever political spectrum you come from, you cannot deny that this genocide has come for almost every culture that my ancestral heritage, and a lot of people in this room have also had that. In our bodies, our traumas are stored deeply in our bodies, and so I don't know. Maybe this isn't a question. This is more me, like, processing what you've been saying, and like very much, like, you've said it in a scientific way that I'm not a scientist, so. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I thank you for that. And I think too, right, like, first of all, like, just reflecting on what you're saying, like, our struggles and our liberations are parallel to each other, right? I think that there are many things happening in the world, all over the world, that like me being Indigenous to Turtle Island can really like feel in my body and relate to other Indigenous communities around the world. And I frankly think that like we can't have liberation for one of us until we have liberation for all of us, which is sort of what I mean about like community building. One of the things that I have in my closing, one of my little bullet points is like, yes, do we need traditional stewards of these medicines in these spaces? Well, maybe. But I think that something that also needs to happen is that if you are invited into these spaces, or even if you're not, like that needs to be respected. If someone says no, that needs to be respected. If someone says, you know what, this medicine is something that my people have been stewarding and it's been misused and we are rebuilding the relationship with this kin, and that needs to happen on our own terms, that needs to be respected too, right? And so I think part of this kind of conversation and openness is like, we need to build a new house together. We need to acknowledge all the things that have happened to get us to needing to knock down this house together and build a new one. And we need to know when we're invited into other people's homes and when it's okay to say no thank you, and kind of have that mutual like respect and relationship, because that is part of reciprocity, is knowing when to give and when to take, and when there is a pause. There is, you know, a comfortable silence that can exist in relationships, and I think that's not something that's like respected enough or talked about enough, is like the power of saying no and actually respecting that. I think that in itself can build trust, and just shows like a kind of sign of respect that I don't often see. I see a lot of people coming into these communities and saying like, oh, we'll give you millions of dollars. We'll, you know, like, oh, we have these deals for you. And it's like, why would I invite you in? Why would I invite you in the house, like with the history that we've had? Even with your millions of dollars, like I just kind of don't give a shit, frankly. You know what I'm saying? Like, but yeah, I appreciate your reflection, and I do think that there are some hard no's in these conversations, right? I think that's okay. Anything else? Yeah.
Real quick question here. I'm speaking from the perspective of being an Air Force brat and a veteran.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. But I have a take on this that has been bothering me, and that is, what we were really dealing with here isn't even about the medicine. It's about the fact that as a colonial entity, and let's not pretend the United States isn't, it has a fundamental fear of the other that you can trace all the way back to the Victorian era. I suspect that any attempt to engage with the existing house, to use your metaphor, will be met with rejection, because that which is not like the accepted norm will never be accepted. The question I have for you is, how do we go about building that house? Because honestly, as a guy who, while I'm proud of my service, and I'm proud of my father's service, and my grandfather's service, and my son-in-law's service, I'm horrified by what I defended. I am disgusted by the ideals that I was raised to believe. I grew up in a world that literally had no racism. Beale Air Force Base. I was a kid. Every culture around us, it was normal. I didn't realize racism was still a thing until I was 19 years old. I know this world can work better.
Yeah.
How do we make that message clear when every megaphone pointed at us is saying, you're wrong for thinking that way? That's my question.
That's a good question, and I don't know if I have a wrapped up nice answer with a bow for you. I do think that, right, like if I go door knocking in North Dakota, where my parents are, and I say, with visible chin marks, right, and I say, hey, my name is Dakota, I'm Indigenous, and I'd like to talk to you about colonization today. I'm going to get a lot of, maybe stand your ground situations, maybe a door slammed in my face. Like, I don't have the same tools that someone like you has to talk to your community in a way that is familiar. And I think that this is sort of that thing of like, we're all on our journeys of learning, we're all on our journeys of unlearning, And like, I don't have the same language and experiences and lived experience and life that someone like you does to be able to approach a veteran in their 50s or 60s and say like, I have feelings about this and I want to talk about this. I think that part of it is that healing and like your own journey and recognizing that, and also kind of understanding that like, yes, we're all here together and we're all going to be here together. We've always been here and we're not going anywhere. They tried really hard to make us go away and that didn't really work out. So how do we move forward together is a journey in trust building and unlearning, and also saying, here's what I still don't know, here's what I would like to learn, and here's what I would like to tell other people. And I think that kind of testimony, you'd be surprised how many people might, be thinking in the shower later that night, even if you just say, I have complicated feelings about this. As a veteran, I have complicated feelings. That could be enough to get someone else thinking. I think part of it is that there are certain communities that don't talk about these things enough, so that we can't get to a place where we have the tools and the resources and the trust to build that new house together. That's gonna take a long ass time. And I don't know if I can tell you, it's gonna be 6 months or 7 years or 20 years. I think it's ongoing, and I think that what I have hope in, even though I'm like a very cheerful nihilist, what I have hope in is that, seeing the kids these days, like Gen Z and kind of these kids just saying like, I don't give a fuck about like how this is going. This is how we're gonna do this. I think that's a respectable attitude. And I think that there are a lot of people who go, absolutely not, like, I don't want to be a part of that. And I think that their attitudes and their behaviors are a reflection of what we've left for them, right? And what we've given them. This is not, their behaviors and their ways and their knowings are not happening in a vacuum. This is the legacy that we are leaving them, where they are saying, and we are teaching them, that you have to be really loud and really aggressive to get the basic things that you need. So I think that the more we can kind of look at a four-dimensional view of how this happened, of history, of time, of community, of relationship, of colonization, and kind of like hold all of that together, I think that's part of how we start breaking this down, right? Because I am often asked to hold a lot of this for people in a medical space, and a lot of people come to me and say, I just want to talk to you about these reflections. And I'm like, that's great, and I'm glad you're having that. I can't be the only one to help you process this, right? And so I really do think that there needs to be more roots into community to say like, I'm glad you're on that journey. I have a lot to hold. I think there are other people that you can help by doing this, right? I think that's going to be I think we have a long way to go. But I do think that these conversations, we are planting the seeds of that, and it's up to all of us to kind of foster that growth and leave something better for these kids that are really needing something and some kind of stability and some kind of relationship that is going to sustain them. So that was just a lot of me rambling, sorry. So anyway, I'm just gonna quickly close. So in general, like in these conversations, I think it's important to like respect the story and kind of take the lessons of what we've talked about here and not like, anyone's names. I think there's a notion in New Age spaces that tends to focus on like innovation or talking about this like return to the old life ways. But who's able to return? I can't go on a trip to Costa Rica. I don't have the money for that. Who's being kept out intentionally, right? These are things I want to leave you with. What can we do to go from passive listening to participation actively and co-responsibility of these conversations? And as a final reminder, like I'm just a little guy. I'm one person, and just because I'm Native does not mean I have all the answers. It doesn't mean that I'm the final voice in this. I am just one person that is kind of straddling two worlds right now, trying to figure out how I can bring my kind of lessons I've learned along the way to help steward these conversations and help grow them. And also, these medicines are our relatives, right? They are our kin. They have been here longer than us. They will be here after we are gone. And it is our responsibility to meet, treat, and use them with integrity and respect. And I think just in general, like, we should be asking questions, we should be curious, we should reflect on what we don't know and what we do know. How can we integrate this into our own communities? How can we ask questions of other communities without extracting from them or using their emotional labor? And just be open, be curious. If you are working in these spaces and you are approached by like an Indigenous community member or someone who has stewarded these medicines, like be open to suggestions, ask questions. And to answer the question of the talk, who owns the medicine? Who owns this? The answer is no one. We belong to it, right? We belong to it, and there is no Western or legal or federal definition that can ever really define that relationship. So I will end with that.